very much, Will, and I'm really excited to be here. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not from here. And the data that I'm going to be presenting are actually from our US retail bank. But we do think there are a lot of similarities between what we're observing there and what we think is happening in countries like the UK and Australia, partly because we are able to look at the patterns that we're observing in very, very great detail in the retail bank and sort of fit them back into some of the national expenditure survey data that we see from all three countries. So I think with some obvious exceptions, and healthcare spending is one of them, the rest of the data is very relevant. So hopefully I'll manage to leave a bit of time at the end for some questions on that as well. So just as a quick overview of what we are trying to do with our retirement business overall, it is about designing, building, and delivering interesting investment products to our clients and their members, but it is much more than that. We really focus a great deal of our resources on the things you see sort of on the bottom left, right? Insights, quantitative, qualitative research, academic partnerships, some of whom are in the room, consumer data and trend analysis, again, stuff that we're able to get from our retail bank, education, content, and tools that we deliver through some of our partner firms, and then a very growing interest in making sure that we are contributing our voices to helping change policy when we think that would be effective. So we are doing a lot of that work around and in support of the way we think about building investment products. But of course, if we're actually trying to help design products that will get people safely to the end of their journey, and do so in a way that keeps them engaged and not afraid of what's going on, we think it's incredibly important to understand both the data that informs patterns of behavior and helps us understand what people actually do, as well as the behavioral sort of nudges and behavioral science that we heard so much about earlier this morning. So when we think about pulling all of that together, right, you've got capital markets and product design, you've got behavioral economics, it's really the data that I think we are just now beginning to scratch the surface of as an industry. So what I'm going to do now is really focus on some findings that I think may be surprising to this audience. So first and foremost, this is coming out of the US defined contribution record keeping system, where it is voluntary for a plan to be offered at all. So only about half of American employers even offer a plan. And it is voluntary if you want to contribute. And I think Steve showed this morning some statistics about what contribution rates are without automatic enrollment, about 53%, and with automatic enrollment, very similar to the rates you see here, right? So if it's left up to the individual, you see a lot of different behavior. What we are showing on this slide is a really important, in my mind, difference between the mean and the median. These are showing median in the purple, median levels of savings at different ages, median levels of loans as a percentage of the account balance. 1 in 6 Americans takes a loan out every year out of their 401k plan. It's permitted. Some would say it encourages participation because you can actually get the money out in the case of emergency. Others would say that it, in fact, is a terrible cause of leakage. And then when people hit the age of 59 and a half, second from the bottom, pre-retirement distribution, that is when the tax penalty for withdrawals goes away. Of the people who take a distribution, and again, it's about 1 in 6 every year over the age of 59 and a half, take some money out, the median amount is 43%. So people are taking huge chunks of their retirement savings out as soon as they can, right? So if you think about 1 in 6 does it every year after the age of 59 and a half, pretty much everybody does this, right, if you run through 6 years through retirement. So it's a huge problem. And then when people retire, almost all the money leaves in one chunk, and you can see that very clearly. The median amount withdrawn once somebody retires is 95. About half the people roll that money over. Half the people cash out the pot. However, 2/3 of the money rolls. I think, Steve, actually, you did some good research on this. 2/3 of the money rolls into an IRA. 1/3 of the money is cashed out. So large pots are getting converted into an IRA. Smaller ones are getting cashed out. So that's on the savings side. What we're now going to dig into is what happens on the spending side. So what we're doing now is looking at spending across about 5.5 million households. JP Morgan Chase has a retail banking relationship through housing, mortgages, auto loans, credit cards, current account, with half of all American households. And of that half of all American households, about 5.5 million, we think we can understand or model accurately all of their spending. So takeaway number one for me here is that in real terms, spending peaks in your mid-50s, which I find personally reassuring. 2 students in university right now, 2 kids in college. But that spending drop is persistent. It's persistent across all wealth levels. The wealthier you are, the steeper the drop. Again, we're showing you the median data here. The less wealthy you are in terms of assets on deposit or wealth invested with us, the flatter that spending curve is. We're doing a lot more work to understand what is discretionary versus non-discretionary at each one of these wealth levels, so we can get a lot more granular. But what's fascinating for me in this data is that in America, we famously have to take care of our own health care. And even though you can see health care, which is the very bottom pale blue line there, even though that increases dramatically, both in terms of outright expense and percentage of total spending, it becomes quite dramatically large at the end, it still never overwhelms the rest of the spending decreases. So the way I like to think about this is actually looking back at my grandmother, who, when she turned 85 for her birthday, asked us to not give her any presents that she could not either read or eat because she was done with stuff. And I love telling that story because I think it is emblematic of what happens as you age. People are done with stuff, and I see it now in my own parents' lives. And I think I'm seeing smiles in the audience. A lot of you have watched that occur in yourselves in your own families. So the need for consumption, the health to be able to consume, travel, entertainment, dining out, transportation, all of them drop rather radically. So some interesting implications for financial planning come out of this. Number one, when we look at the projected inflation rates for retirees, what we observe, again, median data, got to be a bit careful with these averages, as I showed you before. There's quite a broad distribution of behavior here, but the median rate of inflation for someone over the age of 65 is minus 1.5%. That's the rate of real spending. So we are watching their expenditures drop in real inflation, unadjusted terms by 1.5%. I think I just did that backwards. Anyway, real spending. When you adjust that for inflation, it only goes up 1.5%, right? So that is significantly below the observed rate of inflation. It is significantly below the 2.25% that we think we will observe in the economy, in the US economy, over the next 10 to 15 years. So 1.5 versus 2.25. And then it is significantly below the rate that the US government publishes for retirees. They say it should be 3%. So what this is leading us to do is, frankly, overestimate the amount of money most people will probably spend materially if they live to be 95 or 100. Now, I think very few people are actually over-saving, right? I think what they're just doing is feeling really bad about the fact that they have this enormous savings goal they're supposed to be meeting and they're not doing it. So I think the picture is maybe less dire than we imagine it might be, given that I think many financial models overestimate the amount of money people will actually spend in retirement. However, people are not saving enough even for this lower amount. So there's still a lot of work to do, but I think from a behavioral perspective, we do know that giving people goals that seem unachievably difficult is a great way to disengage people from even trying to engage. So I think that's one key takeaway, right? We are probably overestimating how much people will spend. Certainly taking somebody's spending at the point of retirement and then inflating it from that point is probably overestimating it. Point number one. So let's shift what we're going to get out of this data now and look at a different data, still starting with that same 30 million households, half of all American households, cut it down to the households that we have observed retiring in the 5 years that we have data. So this is a household with either a single wage earner as part of a couple who retired, or both working members of the household retired, or it's just a single person. We did not include in this data anybody who had a working spouse who retired and a working spouse who continued working, right? So there's a great deal of clarity in this data about actual retiring, although I will say it took us about 18 months to actually figure out how to identify that moment of retirement from the data we had. It was surprisingly complicated, actually. And just to give you a sense of that, we were looking essentially at people who had labor income. We can see from the kind of sort of wire instructions that happen on the direct deposit into the checking account, the ACH wire that's used in America. We can see that it came from an employer, and we can see if it was either an annuity or a Social Security payment, a national pension, or a defined benefit pension that was wired in. So there's a great deal of clarity on the green bits and the brown bits. Unfortunately, about 60% of the people that are in this age bracket, we actually couldn't tell. So there's a huge bunch of people that we actually literally cannot tell exactly what's going on from this kind of cash transaction. So when people are in their 30s, it's obvious they're all working. When people are in their 90s and they're only getting Social Security, it's really obvious they're retired. But we're doing a lot more work to try to really untangle people's sort of shifting financial lives. But again, there's a key takeaway here, which is that it's a very blurry, messy, episodic process. We see labor income start and stop. We see people claim Social Security and sometimes turn it off again and maybe reclaim it later. We see all kinds of really chaotic behavior. So that is an interesting takeaway right there, that it is probably less predictable for most individuals as they go through this process. It's much less clean than we would imagine. Here's another interesting set of information, the age at which people retire. To claim one's full Social Security benefit in the US right now, you have to be 66, and I'm gonna look at Steve, 4 months, I think, right now this year. And it's going up a month a year until we hit 67. Most people mentally still frame 65 as the normal age to retire, but you can start claiming your Social Security benefit as early as 62. So you will see in this data a big spike at 62, and you see the most common age really being in the 60s. But there's a big bubble of people at the age of 55. We think many of them are firefighters, policemen, armed forces, who typically have to put in 20 years of service to get their defined benefit pension. So that sort of makes sense. What's more interesting, though, is to dig into who we see getting pension income and who isn't getting pension income. Those who have defined benefit pensions are retiring 61%, I'll rephrase that, 61% of the people retiring before the age of 60 have a defined benefit pension. Again, largely firefighters, policemen, we think, state employees, right, who have these benefits. And only 20% of the people waiting into their 60s have pensions. We think this trend will be accelerating dramatically as we move through our own DB sort of roll off, similar to what's happened here. So very interesting as well, if people have got an income, they feel comfortable formally retiring, maybe they part-time, maybe they consult, but that income seems to be critical. So then we started thinking, what actually happens when people retire from a financial planning perspective? Are people spending the same amount year before, year after, more or less? And again, what we're doing here is looking at categories of spending, some of which dropped off here, but really the only category of spending that declines significantly between the year before spending and the year after spending is 1, 2, 3, 4. From the right, that drops 12%, that is transportation. So there's a dramatic drop in transportation costs the year after people retire. Everything else is a bit blurry. And that drop, I think, is because people stop commuting. They're not buying their commuter rail tickets. They're not buying as much gasoline. So on average, 1.2%. However, that average is wildly misleading. So this is a histogram that looks at the change in spending comparing the year before retirement to the year after retirement. The most common range, right, the sort of normal distribution is minus 30% to plus 25%. That's a huge distribution of sort of normal change in spending. And the thing we find really interesting is that enormous fat tail on the end with people. There's a big bulge of people, I think it's 1 in 12 people, spending 100% more the year after than the year before. Now, again, there's a lot more. Every time we ask and answer what we think is a very straightforward question, we have 17 more questions that we now have to answer. So we're pretty sure that big jump in spending on the end there is real estate transactions. At least that's our hypothesis. We will be testing that. But presumably people are either buying a second home or buying something and selling something, and that's what's causing that huge burst in expenditure. Or maybe it's the, take your extended family on the cruise that you've been promising everyone for 20 years when you finally stop working. So that's an interesting tale. So when we think about designing products for retirement, when we think about that conversation about lifetime income, when we think about the role of annuities and guaranteed income and the trade-off that individuals are struggling to make between all DB, all cash pot, all purchase of an annuity, all trying to figure this out by myself, those choices I think are all too binary. And I used to think that many individuals who didn't understand the power of risk pooling for longevity just didn't understand the math, and I felt kind of sorry for them, and if only they knew what we knew, they would all buy annuities. And we look at this data, and it's, I think, a really rational decision for people to really get reluctant at wanting to lock up a lot of their capital in an annuity type purchase, because we don't think they know really well yet what they're going to be doing. I think by the time they hit their sort of middle 70s, there's a lot more predictability in that cash flow, and we're starting to build that data set now. But one key takeaway is that there's a lot of volatility here. There's another way we tried to look at this data, which was to look at rolling time periods of retirees. So we have all these 60,000 people. They retired within a 5-year window. And what we're doing here is taking the 12 to 24 months before retirement for all of them, and then sort of renormalizing that set so that we get a bit of a picture for how the picture evolves over time. And what we can see here is interesting, that there seems to be a surge of spending into retirement and then out of retirement as people get ready for retirement. So I think it would be common in our country and here in the UK for people to spend money fixing up their house. I've still got an income. I want to put the new boiler in, which I know I'll need. The roof is probably going to need redoing. I want to get this sort of infrastructure taken care of so that I can have a more predictable sort of run rate on how much my house will cost as I go forward. We think that's perfectly sensible. We are now, of course, trying to see if that's true. The second thing that may be a little more American is making sure you do predictable medical expenses before you lose your employer health care. For instance, how about that new knee that you know you need to get, that hip replacement, right? The time to do that is when you're still on your employer's health insurance and not afterwards. So I think some of this consumption in the US is also sort of medical consumption that is non-emergency. So again, we're doing more work to validate that. But that tapering off sort of 18 months after retirement, again, we've only got that 6 months of data so far in this totally normalized set, but that does seem to start stabilizing sort of 2 to 3 years out. And as we continue now to add data in 6-month increments, we'll eventually end up with a much more robust time series where we can track these people through time and start seeing what happens. And again, I will say, as there's a lot of very small font disclosure at the end of this, that this is all completely anonymized, and we get this data sort of by various cohorts of behavior by state and by urban and rural. So we are also working to do more to understand what those differences of spending are like in different geographies, but we don't ever get more granular than that. Now, another really interesting thing for us was trying to understand how volatile things were into retirement, right? I showed you this beautiful smooth line that shows you this peak right around retirement, and then it drops. What we're doing now is taking that same 60,000 people and saying, well, how much of them stay sort of relatively steady the year before and the year after, and the 3 years after retirement? So now this is taking 1 year before versus 3 years afterwards. And we're defining steady eddies, people who keep their spending relatively constant, as within plus or minus 20% of their pre-retirement spending. So if you were spending £50,000 before you retire, it means you were staying within 40 to 60 the following 3 years. Only 1/5 of this group of people, 22%, stayed within that relatively narrow bound. We found that shocking. 15% spent less than, again, using those numbers, less than £40,000 the next 3 years. That I might have imagined. Whether that was frugality, a lack of funding, or just they just didn't want to spend the money, we don't know yet, and we're, again, doing more work to try to fit income back into that. But there's only 15% who dropped consistently. 9% spent more than £60,000 every 3 years. So they're the upshifters. And then the other 56% of the people did both. And actually, the 7% roller coasters flip-flop between less than 40 and more than 60. At least once, if not twice. So when we look at this data, back to my earlier point on annuitization and the way we frame these choices for people, right? It may make perfect rational economic sense for someone to get that longevity risk pooling benefit, and any actuary in this room would tell you how powerful that was in terms of using capital efficiently to hedge the tail. But it's a very frightening decision, I think, for many people, because our conclusion from seeing some of this data is that people are trying things on. I thought I wanted to live in Florida, but I hate it. There are too many mosquitoes. I thought I wanted to join this really nice golf club, but what was I thinking? I don't want to talk to any of these people, right? I mean, we see the kind of churn happening that would indicate people flipping around and really changing their lifestyle a bit. So again, this sort of rational brain that says, how can I use this money most efficiently, versus the reality of just being terrified of getting locked into something you can't undo, I think is meaningful. I'll open it up for questions in just a second, but the last thought I want to give you is one about how to think about taking risk. Again, sort of our core business is designing default solutions for members in accumulation and decumulation. And one of the big debates in America is, how much risk should you take? Should you have what's called a through glide path that continues to de-risk as people age, because you've still got this really long time horizon, and as you get older, you really need to think about preserving capital and making sure that the money will last, but you want that early part of retirement to still have a lot of growth assets in it. I think we have come to a very different conclusion, which is that the most dangerous point in retirement to take any investment risk is actually at the moment when your pool of assets or your pot is the largest, because that time series of return loss, if you continue to take capital out, is something you can't recover from. And so what we're illustrating on this page is two things. Number one, the blue line on top is a willingness to take risk. Now, this willingness is nothing more than the average percent that we observe non-advised individuals owning at these ages. So if they're not working with an advisor, they're not in a managed account program, they're not in a default fund, and they're just investing their own money, the average 65-year-old in America has 55% in equity. That's very, very common. And you see that drifting down as people age, and it goes under 40% by the time people are in their 80s. Very common in America. What we're showing on the green line is the capacity to take risk, which we are describing here as the amount of equity risk you could own if you were only willing to lose $5,000 of $100,000 invested, i.e. 1 year of income that you could generate off that $5,000. And you can see those lines just about cancel each other out. People feel like they can take the risk. Again, back to Shlomo's point about the skydiving, that may or may not actually be a very helpful way to truly understand somebody's risk tolerance or risk preference or loss aversion. But this notion that I can handle it, I've got time, right, is very ingrained. But the financial reality is, if you have a $100,000 pot of money, you lose $5,000, that's a year of income wiped out. If you're in your 90s and your pot is now $30,000, you have to have a lot more risk to lose that same $5,000, right? It's a very different calculation. You can think about it as the value at risk of your future income stream based on your current pool of assets, right? It's a very different way to think about it. If any of you have done any of the reading of the academic literature on the U-shape or V-shape glide path, we actually think that makes sense. Now, it's really counterintuitive, and most normal people are horrified by the thought of putting your grandmother in a portfolio that's 80% equity, but it actually might not be irrational from a purely financial perspective. So one of the things we're trying to do a lot of research on is actually, as you start modeling these cash flows, both with this declining real spending and this notion of sort of value at risk of your future income stream, we may end up with very different asset allocations than we normally think is sort of conventional wisdom would dictate. So more to come from us on that front. And before I open up for questions, just one comment on the things that we are now working on. I do sometimes feel like a child in a candy store with all this incredibly cool data that we can do, and we have to be very disciplined about not running down too many rabbit holes. But one of the key things that we are working on now with our data scientist partners is actually looking at check spending. Unfortunately, for our data work, older Americans over 65 typically spend 30% of their money in physical checks that they write. How many here still have a checkbook? I think Americans are very, very behind the times that way. I think if this was America, you'd see every hand in the room go up, and I saw maybe a quarter of your hands go up. So we are now working with the data scientists to actually track where each check is wired. We have the information, it just hasn't been built into the data yet. They're very excited about that. We're also digging into that sort of big blob in the middle of that data set that I showed you. We know who's definitely retired, we know who's definitely not retired, and there's this big mass in the middle. We're getting much more granular on those people so that we understand a little bit more about this transition through retirement. Again, younger workers, it's clear they're younger people, it's clear they're working. 80-year-olds, actually, it's still in our database, about 4% of 80-year-olds are working, just still getting a paycheck. Food for thought. And then we're also using this data to develop personas, people who live in different parts of the country, people who spend a higher fraction of their money on food and restaurant consumption versus gardening and homebodies and travel. They all exhibit different patterns of behavior as they age. And we think that might eventually be a very useful way to start building in nudges, both in the accumulation phase and in the decumulation phase, or certainly help provide people with more context. People like you, who we observe doing X, Y, Z, going to Michelin-starred restaurants or spending all their money buying heirloom tomato seeds, are likely to do this as you age, right? People in your part of the country who live in urban California versus rural Georgia, right? We observe these patterns of behavior. So we think that would be helpful in general as we build out a more robust user interface and engagement with members. And then finally, we are just continuing to add sort of every quarter more and more longitudinal data, and we think that's going to end up, hopefully we'll have decades of this information and can really track what happens to these households through time.